Welcome to this episode of Here's How. In this series, we dive deep into technologies, kind of covering the technology, but also the challenges around automation and how Gluware can provide unique solutions. This is presented in a webinar format, and this webinar is titled Automating a Cisco TrustSec Network with Gluware. I'm Michael Haugh, VP of Product Marketing, and as you can tell, the Here's How is just to get people to pronounce my name right, which is Michael Haugh. And joining me today is our VP of Security, Tim Silverline. Tim, thank you for joining us today to share your wisdom on this challenging topic.
Yep, thanks for having me.
So why don't we go to slide one here, and just to kind of set up the conversation and the challenge that this technology is looking to address. I think, as always, in IT, enterprise IT, security is a hot topic. It's always top of mind. But I would say recently there's been a lot of high-profile data breaches. I've seen the headlines across hotel chains, healthcare companies, retail. These things are always kind of embarrassing. Sometimes the stock takes a hit. You know, they're impactful, and then the company has to go through sending out all data breach users like information about how to protect your information. And I've received numerous letters from credit card companies and Home Depot and others, right? So what has changed, and why? Let's say what is changing. I always think of security starts with kind of perimeter-based defense that's very firewall centric, but there's been a hot kind of buzzword in the security implementation side of the network side around microsegmentation. And I'm trying to gauge from you as we dive into this, is microsegmentation becoming a reality that enterprises are implementing? So with that setup, maybe you could help us understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And the reality is that what's happening is that attackers are just getting better. They're getting more creative, they're getting more skilled, and they're having more time and patience to focus on trying to breach organizations. And what we're seeing with that from a statistic perspective is that it's leading to more of what are considered interactive intrusions. We see a huge increase from year over year in 2023, the amount of interactive intrusions that are happening. And what I mean by an interactive intrusion is something where a user actually breaches a network, and then they spend time basically sitting there and identifying where they can move and actually focusing on how they can cause damage. Where there's actually a person sitting behind the keyboard and manually doing it instead of using just, basic automated scripts or, essentially being a script kiddie and just running things to try and hack stuff, or just using phishing attempts. There's actually people that are getting in and focusing on how they can move laterally inside of a company. And this is what leads to them eventually getting to those crown jewels, that data that ends up being leaked, that might be your personal information or might be some other critical information for companies. And so that's what we've seen in the last year is that's just becoming substantially more prevalent, and it's increasing the level of attacks to a good amount. So with that, microsegmentation is important, specifically because it stops that lateral movement inside of an organization. So traditional perimeter-based firewalls, what they do is they just look for that initial point of entry. But reality is, if a company, if an attacker is determined to get inside of a company, they're typically going to find a way to breach their perimeter defenses, whether that be through a phishing attempt, whether it be through a zero-day exploit, or even a known exploit that they have published and exposed to the internet. Hackers are finding a way to breach that perimeter. And what we do with zero trust network access or microsegmentation policies is, as you can see by the graphic there, you're essentially limiting the scope of the attack so that once a device gets breached, that attack is limited and it's kind of stopped in its tracks at that point because you've limited the rest of the network that it can access. One of the things that has made microsegmentation challenging to implement over the years is, trying to create policies for all the individual IP addresses is just challenging because the people move, devices move, and it's hard to make policies that are effective as these devices are moving and make sure that you're essentially keeping the policies in line with all the different moves, adds, and changes inside of the network. So, what's been happening with, zero trust network access, microsegmentation is people are trying to tie policies directly to identities, either of a device or of a user. because if you can define what the policy should be for a device or a user, and then you can make sure that that policy moves along with that device or user across the network, you don't have to worry about constantly changing the actual policies inside of those, and inside of the network, or actually making manual changes. You're just automatically moving that policy to wherever it needs to go.
So it sounds like we're bridging like the application layer and the identity down to like the layer 3 actual network, or layer 2 or layer 3 network access and accessibility.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we dive into Cisco's approach and Cisco TrustSec, or CTS as we call it for short, is this a Cisco proprietary technology? And if I have, let's say, a Cisco network or Cisco switches in my campus, can I deploy this on existing hardware for the most part, or is it requiring kind of forklift upgrading or getting to the latest series of switches to be able to enable this type of technology?
Right. So to answer your first question, this is a technology that Cisco developed, but they created it as an industry standard. So what Cisco does is they basically added an additional tag into packets, and within that tag, it defines a value for what's a security group tag inside of the packet. This is an industry standard, which means that other vendors can adopt it and other vendors have adopted it. So it is something that Cisco is trying to change in the industry and allow for, this to be adopted everywhere. Now, I'm sorry, I forgot this.
No problem. So that describes kind of the tagging, because once you start putting something into the network, the payload, if you're hitting a Juniper or some other vendor switch, if it doesn't understand that header information, you're not going to have support for it. So if other vendors have implemented it, you could implement this on. Is this mostly campus, or this is campus and data center?
This is focused more on campus, but it is something that can apply to the data center as well. Really, it's any of the devices that are able to use it. Now I'm remembering the second question that you asked me, which is, do you need to have a new hardware in order to implement this? And the answer is no. When Cisco developed this, they did develop it for older hardware as well. You do need to upgrade your firmware to make sure that you're at a level of firmware that's supporting these security group tags, but you don't need to do a forklift upgrade of all your hardware in order to adopt this like you do with some other microsegmentation technologies.
Gotcha.
We can go on beyond that.
So as we get into this, and so we're understanding that TrustSec is an implementation or changing access and rules on the switch layer, and there's a policy layer. In terms of deploying this, what is the challenge? I think often people think, when I talk to our Gluware customers and prospects and related to automation changes, that there's really kind of a very basic approach to automation and in previous products where it's like, just give me these config lines. I have to predetermine the config lines, and I'm just going to net add them or net push them to a device. Why is that basic approach to automation of TrustSec not really viable generally as you're looking at the automated deployment or enabling a network for TrustSec?
Yeah, there's a few reasons around that. Now, I mentioned here in the first line just about the amount of configuration changes that go into each device to enable TrustSec, and that is a factor. However, that can be overcome just by devices that are spraying code and spraying CLI and giving you those additional configuration lines. But one of the things that comes with TrustSec is it spans a bunch of different disciplines and protocols on side of the different devices that you're enabling. And when you enable all these different protocols, you might already have existing configuration tied to them. So you might already have Radius servers that are configured for authentication for a variety of different things. You might already have some stuff configured in your ICE server. You might already have devices that have been onboarded into your ICE server. So what we're able to do really with Gluware, with automation technology, is understand what those existing configurations are, with the knowledge of all the different protocols that have to be implemented and all the different configurations that have to be implemented, and figure out specifically what needs to change in a surgical manner. So that differentiates from tools like Ansible or Python, because, with those tools, you typically are just saying, look, let's apply these CLI lines and just hope that the outcome is going to be okay. But again, when you run into these environments, especially brownfield environments that have a variety of different configurations to start with, you really need to understand what they are and make a very precise changes to make sure that you're not breaking anything that's already in existence and making sure that the intended state at the end is exactly what you want it to turn out to be.
Yeah, that sounds like the key challenge that our customers have had when trying to automate is that if they, let's say, look at any given campus, it's a different starting state. They're not all starting from one common state. It's not greenfield where it's a net new rollout. So when you take into account the so-called brownfield, that's what makes automation a lot harder, in that you have to oftentimes just adding config commands don't result in the policy being exactly what you want, because it could be what you added plus what was already there. You're not necessarily overwriting or removing. And I think that's what we often hear. The benefit of Gluware is that deterministic nature of looking at what's there, then dynamically taking the policy you've created and rendering the commands at runtime, not only adding what needs to be added, but actually removing what shouldn't be there as part of the policy anymore. I think that's a critical component, because otherwise you have kind of this tech debt that's out sitting in your network and extra lines of config that cause problems when you're troubleshooting, or may cause problems with the protocol's operation.
Yep, exactly. So maybe let's talk a little bit about what Gluware does in our initial automation strategy around TrustSec, and how you actually go ahead and implement that. And then we can jump right into the demo and actually demonstrate how this works. So Gluware has built a data model specifically for Cisco TrustSec, where we have allowed all of the different various elements to be configured inside of the Gluware UI that you need to onboard all the devices into a TrustSec environment. Once we've configured that data model in Gluware, that then can be used via over the network to configure ICE via API, as well as do all the CLI configurations of the network devices via SSH. After that happens, we can immediately see that the devices have been onboarded, and we can do some show commands to identify that everything is working properly, before we're going to move ahead with the demo and show how we can deploy an application using Gluware RPA. So when we do that, we're going to just basically select the source and destination tags that we want to create a policy for, as well as select the security group ACL that's going to control traffic between those different security group tags. And finally, what we'll show is a propagation check. This is something that can't easily be done within the Cisco ICE UI today. Essentially, when you make changes into the policy matrix in the Cisco ICE UI, which is where you're controlling the security policy between the different security group tags, it sends a notification to the switches that are being managed by ICE to tell them, check in and make sure you download the latest policy and update it on your devices. But there's no actually way to do a verification of that from ICE. And so that's an additional feature that we've built into the Gluware UI, where we actually can go ahead and demonstrate that, or verify that the policy has been updated on all the switches, regardless of how big your environment is. Yeah, let's jump into the demo. So real quick, just going to show here what we're going to be controlling our communication from. So we have two hosts that are sitting here. You can see they're on the same VLAN. One is at 10.150.289. The other one's at 10.150.288. And we're just going to start a simple ping command from them right now. So since they're on the same subnet, they're currently not enabled in TrustSec. We can see that they're able to freely ping each other. And we'll leave this going during the demo so you can see when changes to the environment happen. We also have our Cisco ICE server. So in our Cisco ICE server here, we can see that we actually haven't added any network devices yet. We also don't have any SXP devices that have been added in here. And thirdly, in our matrix policy, you can see that as this loads, we're going to demonstrate how we're allowing developers and finance to communicate with each other. So in our policy right now, to start out, finance and developers, you can see there's red squares here, which means that they don't have the ability to communicate once they've been onboarded into the TrustSec environment. And then with that, let's jump into the automation inside of Gluware. So we've built a few different workflows here that we're going to walk through. And inside of our network RPA. So network RPA is Gluware's robotic process automation application. And within this application, we basically are able to automate all the different various elements inside of Gluware. The data model that I mentioned and that's used for our Cisco TrustSec integration is something that we've built in our config model editor application. And the network RPA workflows that we see here basically automate the config model editor portion of our utility. So with that, let me jump into and show you what the workflow looks like for the onboarding. In the beginning of this, we just set a workflow context, which is what allows us to save different variables and pass them back and forth. We next have a select targets operation. So there's a variety of different ways inside of these workflows that you can target various devices. The select targets operation is an interactive one. So when we kick off the workflow, you'll see it ask me which devices we want to apply this to, and I'll be able to select those in an interactive way. But you can also do a variety of different targeting mechanisms. You can pick by site, you can pick by any sort of characteristic on the device, what its name is, what its IP address is, all those various things, and automate in a variety of different ways. The next thing we're going to do here is assign a TrustSec domain. And so basically inside of Gluware, we've created a concept of a TrustSec domain, and that's where we define our ICE server and other various elements like the radius secret that we're going to be using, the credentials to authenticate to the ICE server. Next is we define or assign a TrustSec SXP service. So again, actually, I didn't really go into this earlier, but SXP is essentially a layer 3 protocol that Cisco uses to communicate SGT tags over layer 3 boundaries, basically. So if you have two devices that are communicating, that are going through a layer 2 device that does not understand SGT tags, you can use SXP to transfer the information between those endpoints over layer 3. And so in here, we're basically just selecting what our policy service node is going to be for the SXP domain and what the name of the SXP domain is. Next, we'll jump into essentially the TrustSec feature. So this is defining what the commands are that we want to be on a variety of different things. And so in this particular example here, we're showing you what our device tracking policy name is going to be. So device tracking policy is something that's used on the TrustSec devices to basically, again, track devices across the environment. You can pick which VLANs you want to actually enforce TrustSec on. We're just going to do all in this particular case. And then when devices are communicating the SGT tags, the trusted devices are communicating SGT tags between each other. You have to use a static SGT tag in order for that communication to happen. The default is 2, and that's what we're going to use in this example. But if you wanted to use a different one, you're able to define that here. Next, we're going to go into the TrustSec feature selection. So I'll show you real quick here. These are, we have 5 switches in this environment that we're going to be using for demonstration. And so these 5 switches are connected in a loop. And just real quick, I'll show you the configuration is super basic on these. We don't really start out with any sort of radius configuration or any of that. However, to show you our interface targeting capability, I've made some configuration on these first 10 interfaces here. So you can see all those first 10 interfaces are set to be in VLAN 150. 5 of them, however, have a description of no CTS on those ports. And what you can see here is basically what we're going to be targeting is we're going to add the .1x configuration to all the ports that are in VLAN 150. And we're going to exclude, however, any of the switch ports that have a description of no CTS. And you'll see what that looks like after we're done with the configuration and it's done provisioning. You can also see here some of the radius settings. So, for example, AAA groups, things like that, the CTS lists that you might want to do from a network auth perspective, where you want to source your radius communication from, and maybe you have a VRF that you want to specify where it's coming from. And again, we're specifying our radius servers here that are coming from that we're going to be communicating with 4.1x. Next command just is associating assembly with a node. So assemblies are basically the way that Gluware groups various different commands together. And so that's where we're taking all that information that we just created in these features, and this is how we're going to associate that onto the switches. And then the last one really is just provisioning the devices. All right, let's go ahead and run the workflow and see how it looks. Now, as I mentioned here, it's going to ask us to select which devices we want to do. So let's go ahead and select all 5 switches just by moving them over. Click Save, and it should kick off the rest of the workflow here. It's going to run through this first parts here in about 30 seconds, and then it'll start provisioning, and we can take a look at the provisioning logs from Config Model Editor once that starts happening and see all the things that it's doing on the switches.
And Tim is here running here, and we can talk a little bit while it's running. I mean, I think this is a great example of how a complex automation scenario is much harder to automate, and how Gluware's flexibility, especially looking at mapping up into process automation here in Network RPA, you're automating changes via an API on the ICE server. On the device itself, you're automating multiple protocols and at different levels. At the global level, you have things like Radius and AAA and .1x. Then you have to go down into the interface level, the VLAN or even VRF level. So you can see just that level of complexity when trying to do it with what I would call old school automation, basically just pushing commands that don't necessarily have awareness of where they're at and the hierarchical UI structure, as well as knowing what the current state is. So I think it's a great example of complex automation that Gluware is strong at.
Yep, definitely, absolutely. And we can go and take a look at some of the things that it's doing right now as it's running through these devices and see all the various checks that it's doing before it actually starts applying commands.
And that's an interesting note to bring up in that this is automating config modeling, which is Gluware's config management technology. And config modeling does a certain preset of kind of, let's say, validations. It's doing a certain level of node validation, and then it's looking at configuration validation. But using Network RPA, you could actually add in tasks, additional tasks, pre and post change to implement more custom tasks. Maybe you want to assess state. Maybe you want to automate the application reachability, like you're doing with ping test, but you could automate calling a playbook or a script that's doing some form of validation at up like an application layer.
Okay, so now that we finished, why don't we jump over to the switch and take a look at the configuration and how it changed. As you can see here at the top, we have some of our additional radius configuration that's been added. We have our device tracking policy as well that's been created. As we scroll down here, we can start to actually take a look at some of the individual interface changes that were made as well. So as we discussed in the very beginning, we're targeting some specific ports. And as I showed, the first 5 of these ports of the switch are going to be the ones that we're targeting because they are in VLAN 150 and they didn't have that description of no CTS that excluded them. As you get down a little bit further, you can see that we did not apply any of that configuration to these other ports because of that description. Jump down a little bit further, we can see some of the other configuration that was applied. So these are our trunk ports that are connecting in between the switches. The Gluware was able to determine via some show CDP neighbor commands that these connected to other devices that were included in the CTS environment that we built. And because of that, it automatically knew that it was going to add CTS manual. It was going to turn off role-based enforcement on those ports and set the tag for the trusted information to be SGT of 2. You can see some additional radius configuration that was set up down here around various aspects of the radius environment. And that's that. As we can see here, we should be able to see that the switches, the hosts are actually being detected now and being mapped properly. And you can see here that one of our hosts has been mapped into the SGT tag of 23, which is for the developers, I believe. And on our other switch here, you can see that another one's been tagged into SGT of 8, which I believe is for the finance department. So with that, let's go back and take a look at our pings. And we can see here that while we were configuring that information, or after the switches have been properly onboarded, the pings have stopped. And again, the reason for that is because as we look at our policy, that we're currently not allowing any traffic between the finance and the dev application. You can also see here in ICE that we now have our 5 switches that have been added, both as network devices and as SXP devices. And with that, let's jump back over into our Gluware environment and show our second workflow that we're going to demonstrate today, which is this deploying a dev and finance application. So I'll quickly jump inside of it here and show the information. So again, we have a workflow context just for some variable saving. We're going to select the TrustSec domain that we're using, the same one that we picked in the earlier workflow. And then we're going to deploy an application. And so here, we're basically just creating an application name. We're going to select the source and destination SGTs for the application. And then what is the role-based access list? In this particular case, we're just going to do a permit all. But Cisco TrustSec does allow you to have layer 4 ACLs, that getting granular down to the port level if necessary. And then the last thing we're going to do is perform an SGT propagation check. And so what we do with the SGT propagation check is Gluware SSHs into all the various devices after it has deployed the application and make sure that the policy residing on the switches is matching the policy that has been configured in the policy matrix. So with that, let's go ahead and execute. In this particular one, we don't have any switches to select, so it's not going to interactively ask us that. It's just going to jump right through it. And this should really only take maybe 30 to 45 seconds to do. It's really just doing a quick API call to ICE to update the policy, and then reaching out to the switches via CLI and running a handful of commands to make sure that they're all in sync. Obviously, if you have a little bit of a larger network, it could take maybe a couple minutes or something in order for Gluware to reach out and do all the show commands on all the switches in the environment. In this case, we have 5 switches, so it should take about 30 to 45 seconds, I think.
So Tim, this is kind of an example of a day 2 move, add, change type of activity you would do in a TrustSec network, right?
Yeah, exactly. So once you have everything onboarded, that's mainly what you're doing is adjusting the policy and just making sure that your applications can reach each other as needed, and that you're not allowing any additional traffic beyond what you're expecting to allow. So yeah, definitely a day 2 operation. So with that, we have a completion. So let's take a look at our policy. As it slowly loads. And you can see that it has been permitted now. We're allowing that traffic between dev and finance. And let's double check and make sure that we have resumed communication. And you can see here on both sides, just shortly ago, this then started being allowed. And that's really what I wanted to show from a demo perspective today. So let's jump back into the slide deck.
So Tim, I'll take this one and maybe you can add color commentary, but like when we asked the question, well, why Gluware and why is Gluware a fit for this type of automation? The first thing is that while we jumped right into a pretty complex automation scenario where we're automating complex configurations, both CLI down at the switch layer and API integration with a policy server, oftentimes automation fundamentally begins with the inventorying of the network devices, the basic discovery, being able to audit them for the configuration state, being able to monitor drift. You mentioned you can't even roll out TrustSec until you've upgraded to a certain level of iOS or NXOS, right? So then you get into config management, process automation. We're kind of already there, but one thing that Gluware brings is that whole suite of no-code applications for the lifecycle management. So there's a lot of steps that have taken place before we get to this stage of what I would call complex config management with config modeling, which we were showing, and process automation, which is a network RPA. The other piece that we've been discussing is that Gluware's state-aware, intent-based approach allows us to automate the complex or the brownfield. So we can have a common automation policy, and it can be successful with whatever state the target device is in. So this is a really key differentiation point. and that to remove statements that shouldn't be there, kind of cleaning up as you go as you're changing configurations. And these last two bullet points are more specific around network RPA. And network RPA is about bringing process automation, right? Having repeatable end-to-end processes where you can see in that automation, there's many steps involved. So if you're a user and you have to do things manually step by step, that's going to be more time consuming. There's more areas for user error. There's more probably areas where you have to get data from one place and put it in another, like a VLAN information or an IP. Any of that can be made, a mistake can be made. So by delivering or providing a drag and drop process automation that ensures that process is repeatable and consistent and predictable is really the key to it. And the final automation, the final bullet here is around, once you build your process, a process to be automated, it can be triggered, meaning API trigger, some external trigger can call it. You can call it via an API. You can integrate with external systems like ITSMs, like ServiceNow, or CMDBs like ServiceNow and others. So you can begin to automate the whole entire process that may not just be configuring devices. It can be, in this case, policy servers. You could be opening and closing ServiceNow tickets. You can be ingesting information from a config management database or some external source of truth. So it's about reaching more, let's say, end-to-end, the full process automation for lifecycle management. So those are the key things that our users find really the benefits of Gluware, and why Gluware, especially with Network RPA, which is our second newest app, but it has been in the marketplace for 2 years, and it has been really well adopted.
Yep. These are all great points, Mike. So, I mean, really, like, I think what we want to talk about now is just how Gluware plus Cisco is really the ultimate data center and edge story, right? So we offer a variety of different ways that we integrate with Cisco as well as other vendors, but really with Cisco, we're very synergistic in our automation. So we can do things from simple tasks all the way up to being able to do a full EVPN VXLAN deployment with secure segmentation, leveraging our solution. Secure root tabs, as we talked about, is an industry standard-based approach to network segmentation that Cisco has adopted and has offered up to the entire industry to take advantage of as well. Zero trust access with microsegmentation, leveraging Cisco's TrustSec is a great option, and using Gluware to do the onboarding and management of those policies, as well as network devices and SGTs, is a kind of a seamless way of taking this technology and running it inside of your environment without having to understand all the complexities of all the individual lines of code that go on all the devices, as well as all the different various user interfaces for Cisco ICE. And what we offer when you take advantage of the solution is really investment protection. You can take advantage of your existing hardware and just upgrade the software to be able to take advantage of this great technology and be able to deploy microsegmentation inside of your environment in an easy, streamlined manner. And then at the end of the day, what we offer is a single operational model. This can help you simplify operations and drive efficiency inside of your environment.
The only thing I'd add in there, Tim, is some of our customers or prospects ask how we coexist or compare with DNA Center. And generally, it's the positioning is, when customers are using DNA Center for a specific purpose, maybe they're managing their Cisco wireless, maybe they're using it for some monitoring purposes, maybe they're executing some upgrades with it. So where DNA Center lives, if it's successful in accomplishing part of the automation strategy, Gluware can successfully coexist with it and then fill in the gaps and do other things that DNA Center is not doing. Gluware has multi-vendor support. Gluware supports really old and kind of legacy Cisco products and others. And Gluware's process automation with Network RPA really puts it in a unique position to integrate and tie things together like we are doing in this example with automating the ICE server and the network layer switches. So I just wanted to add that in.
Okay, great point.
So this is the last slide. It's really kind of our closing slide. We like to kind of, just from a marketing perspective, say like drag, drop, done. Like with Network RPA, it is really empowering to just be able to drag in things from your pre-built automation suite, automating things like configuration management and discovery and audit, being able to drag those things in, drag in even integrations with third-party systems like the ICE server, and automate them end to end. So, although this was a Cisco specific demo, Gluware is automating multi-vendor, multi-platform, meaning routers, switches, firewalls, load balancers, really anything in the network layer, and multi-domain. This is more campus oriented, but this technology can expand into data center, and that right there is, multi-domain. So if this is of interest to you, we encourage you to go to gluware.com, reach out through Contact Us. If you want to kind of kick the tires and get a hands-on example of how Gluware can be used, we recommend you sign up for our test drive. So currently, TrustSec is not part of that test drive, but at least you could use the applications and use Network RPA and see how it could work in your environment. So with that, Tim, thank you very much for joining me here on the Here's How series and this webinar. And thank you all very much for your time and attention. Bye.
Thank you.